All right, we are on page 59 on occasionally. Occasionally, Joanne and Fred's son would appear on the show, but mostly Fred made sure his children grew up out of the spotlight. He wanted them to have normal childhoods. Someone once asked Fred's younger son, John, "What's it like to have Mr. Rogers for a father?" John answered, "Well, he's the only father I have ever had." For many other children, Fred was also like a father. They felt they could always count on him. Page 60. Johnny Costa. Johnny Costa was born in Pennsylvania and learned to play the accordion by the time he was 7. By age 10, he was earning money performing at weddings and parties. In high school, he mastered the piano and he went on to earn a college degree in music. Costa later became a well-known jazz pianist. He was the musical director and keyboardist on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood from the program's debut in 1968 until his death in 1996. Chapter 7: A Close-Knit Community. Each show started the same way. As Fred sang the opening song, he took off his jacket and hung it in the closet. Then he put on a cardigan sweater, usually one his mother had knitted. Next he traded his dress shoes or loafers for a pair of sneakers. 62-63. He might talk about caring for a pet, recycling, or sharing. He also talked about things children might worry about. Did a haircut hurt? Nope. He got one to prove it. What about a shot at the doctor's office? Yes, but only for a moment. In one famous episode, Fred assured children they could not get sucked down the bathtub drain. They were too big to fit. Fred also took field trips to interesting places like a crayon factory or a mushroom farm. He made films of these trips and showed them on Picture-Picture, a picture frame in Mr. Rogers' house that changed into a movie screen. A visit to the neighborhood of make-believe was always part of the program, too. The adventures of King Friday, Queen Sarah Saturday, and all the other puppets were always exciting for children. Fred thought kids needed both a little real and a little pretend in their lives. 64-65. Who lives in the neighborhood? Hundreds of people and puppets appeared on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood over the years. Some lived in the real world, some stayed in the neighborhood of make-believe, and some traveled back and forth. People. Mr. McFeely, named for Fred's real-life grandfather. Mr. McFeely worked for the Speedy Delivery Service and brought packages to Mr. Rogers' house. Officer Clemens. In the real neighborhood, Francois Clemens ran a dance studio with his wife. He was a policeman in make-believe. Joe Negri. Mr. Negri owned a music store in the real neighborhood and worked as a handyman in make-believe. Betty Aberlin. Betty operated a local theater in the real neighborhood. In the neighborhood of make-believe, she became Lady Aberlin, the king's niece. Puppets. King Friday, the ruler in make-believe, was born on Friday the 13th. He had a good heart, but was terribly bossy. Daniel Striped Tiger, a shy tiger who lived in a clock. Daniel was Fred's very first TV puppet character. Lady Elaine Fairchild. Lady Elaine ran a museum and could be a real troublemaker at times. Henrietta Pussycat. Henrietta was shy but helpful. She could say only a few words in English. She said meow for everything else. 66-67. Fred always wanted to do what was best for his young audience. When he asked a question, he paused to let viewers think about the answer. Nothing that happened was very fast or zippy. When he first started doing the show, Fred flipped his shoes in the air as he was changing them. He stopped when he heard kids were copying him and bonking themselves on the head. Children saw the same familiar people and places in each episode. Fred showed them how important it was to have a community of friends and neighbors. But he sometimes introduced kids to a bigger world. One time, he invited astronaut Al Worden to appear on the show. Worden had been a crew member on Apollo 15, a mission that went to the moon in 1971. He showed kids how to put on a spacesuit and described what it was like to orbit the moon. 68-69. In another episode, Fred went to the Soviet Union, now Russia, where he appeared on a similar children's program. At the time, the Soviet Union and the United States were in the middle of the Cold War. Both nations wanted to prevent the other from gaining too much power. Did that mean Soviet kids were bad or strange? Turns out they weren't. They were a lot like children in the United States. Fred wanted children to look up to him as a reliable adult. He was always friendly, but never too casual. At the end of each program, Mr. Rogers sang again, "It's such a good feeling to know you're alive. It's such a happy feeling you're growing inside." The message was the same one his grandfather had told him years before. You are special. Fred believed that with all his heart, and the children who watched his show believed it too. Chapter 8, 70-71, Tackling Tough Issues. Do you poop? Fred got used to answering that question. Kids asked it all the time. They also wanted to know things like how he got in and out of the TV set. Fred tried to answer everything honestly and directly. He read every letter he got, and he always wrote back. Sometimes he sat up late at night with Joanne, and together they worked through the mail. It was slow going. They kept stopping to read the letters out loud to each other. But Fred got a lot of new ideas for shows from those letters. There was nothing too small or too big for him to talk about. Discussing difficult topics made some adults want to change the subject. Not Fred. He talked about the war in 1968 when the United States was in a war in Vietnam, and again during the Gulf War with Iraq in the early 1990s. He also tackled divorce, reassuring children that it wasn't their fault if their parents split up. Fred knew children got sad, angry, and anxious just like adults did. Talking things out usually made people feel better. But Fred didn't always use words. Some things didn't need explaining. They just needed doing. One of the first people Fred added to the neighborhood cast was an African-American man named Francis Clemens, who played a policeman. One hot afternoon, Mr. Rogers had a wading pool set up in his backyard. 72-73. He invited Officer Clemens to sit down and relax for a bit. They took off their shoes and socks and soaked their feet in the cool water together. Not long before the show aired, it had been perfectly legal to prevent black people from sharing the same swimming pools or beaches with white people. That had only changed after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. Some white people still looked down on African Americans, but Fred believed everyone should be treated the same. He didn't say a word about it, but he made it clear when he put his feet next to Officer Clemens in the pool. The Civil Rights Movement. Even though slavery, the act of owning another person, was made illegal in 1865, black people still did not have many rights. In many places, African Americans could not vote or own houses. They could not attend the same schools as white people or use the same bathrooms. During the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 1960s, African Americans joined together to protest this treatment. They held marches to demand equal rights. Some white people were angry about it, but many others supported the cause. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. It guaranteed the same rights for all Americans. 74-75. In 1968, two very important American leaders were assassinated. One was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a leader in the Civil Rights Movement. The other was Senator Robert Kennedy. He was the brother of President John F. Kennedy. Robert Kennedy had been running for president himself. Both King and Kennedy were killed because of their political beliefs. Fred knew kids were hearing a lot about the violence happening in their country. He worried about how they would handle it. Fred stayed up all night to tape a special show about the death of Robert Kennedy. During the program, Lady Aberlin talked with Daniel Striped Tiger to explain what had happened in the most gentle way that Fred could think of. At the end of the episode, Fred spoke directly to parents. "I plead for your protection and support of our young children," he said. "There is just so much that a very young child can take." 76, 77. Fred could not protect children from big problems like violence or death, but he tried to make things less scary. When he was a child and something bad happened, Fred's mother had told him, "Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping." That's what Fred was doing, and that's what he was teaching kids to do. Chapter 9. A Powerful Voice. One day in 1969, Fred traveled to Washington, D.C. to talk to a committee of U.S. senators. At the time, public television received about $20 million per year from the government. President Richard Nixon had suggested cutting that amount in half to save money. That would be a huge loss for public television. Many programs would probably be canceled. It was not up to the president, though. Only Congress had the power to make that decision. Fred was invited to speak to the Senate committee. Maybe he could help save the funding for public television. Fred was good at talking to kids about important issues, but could he work his magic on adults? 78, 79. The senator in charge, John O. Pastor, was a gruff, no-nonsense person. For 2 days he'd already listened to many different people speak. Fred hoped Senator Pastor would want to hear what he had to say. A lot depended on it. Fred might have been nervous, but he did not let it show. He spoke about how violence on television worried him. Then he explained how he used his program to help children talk about their feelings. "I feel that if we in public television can only make it clear that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we will have done a great service," Fred said. Senator Pastor listened closely. Fred's words were having a big effect on him. "I'm supposed to be a pretty tough guy," he said, "and this is the first time I've had goosebumps for the last 2 days." When Fred finished speaking, the senator said, "I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million. 80, 81. Fred sat back in his chair and smiled. He was so relieved. He'd only talked to the committee for a few minutes, but it had been worth it. Now there would be enough money for him to keep making his program. Fred believed he was doing important work on the neighborhood. He was teaching lessons that would help kids become happy people. Sometimes they were small lessons that didn't need much explaining. Once on the show, he buttoned his sweater wrong and it came out crooked. Rather than shout "cut" and start over, Fred just laughed and fixed it on camera. Mistakes were part of life, and so was fixing them. The most important lesson was making sure kids understood that they did not have to do anything special in order to be special. That came just by being themselves. When he was asked why he devoted his life to children, Fred answered, "Well, the children become adults." He meant that when children grew up, they would remember their experiences from childhood. The things they learned as kids would help or would determine how they acted as adults. Fred wanted to be sure he was sending positive messages to the children in his audience.